Good evening and welcome to tonight's lockdown lecture, our first one of 2021. I hope you're all keeping safe and doing okay during lockdown 3. I know it's strange times again, and we're really thrilled to still be able to bring these lectures to you through this. As you can see, the museum team are all working from home again. So it's a strange time for museums, and it's lovely for us to continue to bring this kind of content to you in your homes. We're really thrilled to be partnering with the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum for tonight's lecture. I think it's going to be really interesting. Both David and Paul are such fascinating chaps to listen to that I think you're in for a really good evening. A couple of updates from me. We are still frantically fundraising, so if you are looking for any gifts or anything, our Adopt an Aircraft scheme is proving pretty popular, so do have a look at that. We've also, because we're shut again, and I suspect likely to be shut for some time, we're extending all memberships by another 3 months. So even if you take up a membership now, it won't kick in until we reopen. Probably around Easter. So yeah, lots of things to think about. We are absolutely not sitting still. We're still cracking on with everything, and we will continue to bring you monthly lectures as we have been. And we're looking at some new ideas as well. So watch this space. Do sign up to the email newsletter if you haven't already, and hopefully there'll be some more exciting news coming soon. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Ursula from the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum to introduce them, and I really hope you enjoy this evening's lecture, and thank you for all your support.
In this privately funded county military museum, still relatively new, having only opened in 2014, we aim to tell the stories which illustrate the impact of conflict on the county and its people. We're very pleased, therefore, to be doing this joint online talk with the Museum of Army Flying. We are planning several more, and details of these will be publicised soon. David Innes, a SOFO trustee, will tell the story of the Grand Battle, which took place in Normandy, that famous day when Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire men were in the vanguard of the Allied invasion of Europe on D-Day. The story you will hear is much as told by John Howard, the commander of the Coup de Main, to Christopher Dunphy and Gary Johnson in their book, Brightly Shone the Dawn. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and if you would like to donate to the museum, please click on the donate button on the screen. Thank you for supporting the museum.
Hello, good evening, welcome to the Army Flying Museum. I'm Paul Beaver. Welcome, in fact, to Season 4 and the first episode of our lockdown lectures. We're working with the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum for this first event. We're going to tell you the story of what happened to the soldiers who were deposited on D-Day right next to the bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River. This is an amazing story of the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry. To tell us that story is Brigadier David Innes. But before I let David weave that tale, I'm going to tell you, perhaps remind you, about the Airspeed Horsa and the Glider Pilot Regiment. So let's go and look at a Horsa. Well, this is a Horsa, but obviously it's a wonderful scale model we have here at the Army Flying Museum, but it serves our purpose very well. You can see the scale of the aircraft. That's an 88 feet wingspan. Now that's only 15 feet shorter than a Lancaster bomber, and yet this aeroplane has no engines. It carries 25 people or so in the back here, carefully distributed for weight and balance. To a pilot, weight and balance is always important, but it's very important for a glider because it's going to be towed into battle by a Halifax or a Stirling bomber. Around 3,000 of these aircraft were built, many of them at Christchurch in Hampshire, it's now Dorset, and they were used by the Army for depositing troops and for guns and equipment from every battle from Sicily to the eventual defeat of Germany. It weighs about 7 tons, So it's got quite a phenomenal performance when it's cast off. It's going to fly around 160 miles an hour when it's in the tow, going down to about 100 miles an hour in the descent, because of course descent is what it's going to do. But underneath are huge flaps, which allows real control when it comes in. The story of the 6 gliders that landed just before D-Day and the 3 that landed in what we now call Pegasus Bridge is of course legendary. But I'll let David Innes tell you that full story. Let me just sum it up by saying, in the words of Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, this was the greatest feat of aviation of the Second World War. Now, coming from a senior Air Force officer and talking about NCO Army pilots, that is the highest praise you could ever expect. At the Army Flying Museum, we're proud to tell the story of the Glider Pilot Regiment. We're proud to work with the successors of the light infantry, today called the Rifles. This is a magnificent story. So now let's listen to David Innes.
General Gale, known to his men as Windy, was the commander of the 6th Airborne Division, and he had a problem. Planning his division's operations in support of D-Day, he realized that 2 of his first objectives was to seize bridges on the eastern flank of the bridgehead over the Caen Canal and the Orne River. They were on the eastern flank of the Normandy bridgehead, and unless captured, could be used by the Germans to threaten the beachhead itself. The problem was, who should do this and how? Realizing that the 2 most important factors to achieve success at these bridges, which you can see on the left here, would be surprise and speed, he decided on a nighttime gliderborne Coup de Main operation. One of the battalions in the Air Landing Brigade of the 6th Airborne Division was the 2nd Battalion, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. And he selected D Company of this battalion, which was commanded by a young man from Oxford called John Howard. Howard's aggressive style and attention to detail in training had caught Gale's eye. Howard's force of 4 rifle platoons was strengthened for the operation by 2 additional platoons, making a total of 6, 25 men in each. And planning how to seize the 2 bridges, he allotted 3 platoons to each. Most of Howard's men were young, in their 20s, fit, keen to play their part in the war, and by that stage trained to the utmost in their role. One officer was 19-year-old Lieutenant David Wood, who flew in the 2nd glider, clutching to his chest a canvas bucket full of hand grenades. He was followed in number 3 glider by Lieutenant Sandy Smith's platoon. Smith was a Cambridge Rugby Blue and a keen cricketer. With John Howard in the 1st glider was Lieutenant Den Brotheridge and his men. Brotheridge was to die in the operation at the age of only 29. Howard considered him one of his closest friends. The first 3 gliders were to head for the Canal Bridge, seen here from the air, while gliders 4, 5 and 6 were to capture the other bridge over the River Orne, seen here before the war as a railway bridge. Howard, of course, did not know in which order the gliders would arrive, or even how many would get there at all. So in their training, all 6 platoons practiced all the necessary tactics and drills, and although it would have been more difficult, they were confident that if only 1 glider got to each bridge, they could still do the task, undertake the task. For the same reason, they had with them in each aircraft 5 engineers from 249 Field Company, Royal Engineers, sappers, whose job it would be to deal with any explosive demolition charges laid by the Germans. The second group of 3 gliders, numbered 4, 5 and 6, were commanded by Captain Brian Priday, the second in command, and they were to head for the bridge over the River Orne. This was the less well-defended bridge of the two, but still all three platoons, one in each glider, had trained hard to perfect their plan of attack. In the event, the fourth glider, with Priday and Lieutenant Hooper, went astray and landed several miles away. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's see how the operation got underway. On the 26th of May, John Howard's force moved to a transit camp at Tarrant, Rushton, just east of Blandford Forum in Dorset. This is it from the air. There, for the first time, they met the men who were to fly their gliders. They were NCOs in the Glider Pilot Regiment, all volunteers and veterans of the Sicily campaign of 1943. They were a splendid group of chaps and were soon getting on well with Howard's men. The senior amongst them was Sergeant Jim Walwork, and all of them had been in training for this operation for several months, and boasted, not without justification as it proved, that they could land one of their gliders on a sixpence. Once at Tarrant Rushton, there was a total security clampdown, and no one was allowed out of the camp except for Howard himself to go to his divisional headquarters for orders. There was a flurry of final preparations, and all manner of fascinating gadgets were issued. Compasses disguised as buttons, silk maps to be sewn into clothing, and for the officers, wallets full of French francs. Apparently Howard lost his playing poker with the Padre. On the 28th of May, Howard was authorized to brief his officers and 2 days later to bring all the soldiers into the story. They were astonished at the amount of information made available to them. Housed in a hut, maybe something like this, was a huge scale model and sets of air photographs. This is not a model, of course, but it would have shown every detail of the ground and the enemy defences that Howard and his men could expect to encounter when they landed. From then on, that hut was full of men going over and over their own and everyone else's tasks. In addition to the Caen Canal on the left and the Orne River Bridge on the right and the two bridges over them, you should note the two landing zones in pale green beside the bridges, and the village of Benouville to the left, that is to the west of the canal. All these are central to our story. Then, just as confidence was at its height, disaster loomed. One day, the routine aerial reconnaissance flight showed that the Germans were erecting long poles on the flat stretches of ground near the bridges which had been chosen as landing zones. Howard's morale plummeted. It seemed obvious that the enemy had wind of the plan and were preparing a warm welcome for his company. With a heavy heart, he showed these photographs to Sergeant Jim Walwork, his leading glider pilot. But to his amazement, the pilot was delighted. "That's just what we need," Walwork said. "You remember the embankment where we end up by the road?" Howard nodded, mystified. "Well, we've always been worried about piling into that if we overshoot the landing zone. A heavy landing, one grenade going off by accident, and woof, up would go the whole aircraft. Now these stakes are spaced just right to take a foot off each wing, and that will pull us up just nicely." Howard laughed with relief, and after that never gave the stakes another thought. At 0900 on the 4th of June, a dispatch rider rode into the camp at Tarrant Rushton and handed an envelope to Howard. This was what they'd been waiting for. The operation was on. Then the weather closed in. The order to move was cancelled, and Howard's company experienced great feelings of deflation and anticlimax. Not many of them slept that night. Next morning, there was no cancellation. Stores were packed, weapons checked, and personal belongings handed in for safekeeping. And at 2200 hours, they drove to the airfield. Howard went round saying a rather poignant farewell to everyone as they blackened their faces and clambered aboard their gliders. Each aircraft, with 2 pilots, carried 30 men, 25 men from D Company, including some medics, and 5 sappers, and as much ammunition as they could cram in for their standard issue weapons of the time: rifles, Bren guns, Sten guns, mortars, and handheld Piat anti-tank weapons. You'll appreciate that this is very light scales of equipment. This was a coup de main force, equipped for surprise and speed, not much more. This picture shows how Tarrant Rushton Airfield looked the following day. That night, of course, they were only loading the 6 gliders required for this very special operation, but it gives a sense of the drama of the occasion. This slide, taken at ground level, shows beneath the wings of other aircraft troops crossing the tarmac to board their glider. At 22:56, the first Halifax towing aircraft roared down the runway and lumbered into the night sky. The 5 other aircraft followed at 1-minute intervals until they were all airborne and heading for the coast of France. Howard flew with 1 platoon, as he hoped that this would be the first to land nearest to the canal bridge. The Halifaxes were heading for a gap in the anti-aircraft defences which was known to exist near Cabourg, on the coast just to the northeast of the bridges. The Royal Air Force had been using this gap for months on supply drops to the French resistance, and all the bombers and the gliders that they were towing got through unscathed, although there was heavy flak on both sides of the gap. They cast off at 6,000 feet, and the gliders turned on course for their landing zones, aiming to lose height rapidly until they reached 1,000 feet and then to level out for the final run-in. This picture was, of course, taken in training, but it shows how they might have approached their landing zone. It was 7 minutes to touchdown. John Howard sat opposite the front door in the leading glider. Soon after casting off the tow, Den Brotheridge, the platoon commander, stood up, the men on either side of him holding onto his kit, and he opened the sliding door opposite Howard. Looking out, he could see the gleaming lines of the canal and the river as they crossed the dark fields below him, as the pilot confirmed with a thumbs-up sign that they were on course. It was an eerie feeling as they swooped towards the earth. Except for the sound of the wind rushing past, all was quiet as the men sitting down each side of the glider braced themselves for the impact and shock of landing. Suddenly, what seemed to the tensed-up troops to be a stream of tracer bullets shot past the open door. But there was no firing, only a huge bump as one of the glider's skids bounced off a rock, raising another shower of tracer-like sparks. There was a great lurch, and then they were airborne again. Then, bang! Down once more, bumping along the ground, with a tearing, rending and crashing noise until abruptly they came to a halt, followed by complete silence. It was 16 minutes past midnight, and they were down, just under 50 feet from the pillbox on the canal bridge, with the nose of the glider through the enemy wire defences. This picture, taken a few hours later, shows how close they were to their objective. You can see 2 of the crashed gliders to the right of the bridge. Howard sat for a moment in inky blackness. He couldn't understand why it was so dark, as he knew it was a half-moonlit night, and he had seen cattle in the fields during the run-in. For an awful moment, he feared he had gone blind from the bump he'd got on the back of his head as they landed. Then a wave of relief as he realised that his steel helmet had fallen down over his eyes and blinded him. One of the pilots had not been so lucky, and moaning could be heard from the cockpit of the glider. But most of the platoon seemed unhurt and were soon pushing and scrambling their way out of the glider through the doors and wreckage of the fuselage. This is an artist's impression of the scene, with Howard's glider on the left, his men running towards the bridge, which is on the right, and out of view, with the Café Gondry in the background, the other side of the canal. Howard saw his leading men reach the enemy pillbox by the bridge and hurl their grenades through the weapon slits as they had practiced so often in England. As the muffled thump of the explosions boomed out, the rest of the platoon doubled across the bridge, their boots clattering on the road surface. When the leading men reached the far end of the bridge, the German defenders seemed suddenly to wake up, and all hell broke loose. The night sky was lit up by a firework display of coloured tracer fire. Amid this cacophony, there were 2 loud crashes from the landing zone. The other 2 gliders had arrived, right on target. Howard could hardly believe his luck, but sure enough, David Wood, the platoon commander from the first of these aircraft, soon ran up with his men. Howard told him that 1 platoon were over the bridge, according to plan, and that he was to get on with clearing the enemy trenches on the eastern bank with his platoon. That is the bank on the side where they'd landed. As Wood moved off, a runner panted back over the bridge. Den Brotheridge had been hit leading his platoon off the far side of the bridge and was lying severely wounded in the open. At that moment, Sandy Smith, 3 platoon commander, reached Howard with his arm tucked into his battle dress jacket. His platoon, the last of the 3 gliders, had had a bad landing. Several men had broken limbs. 1 was missing. He himself had a broken arm, but was ordered over the bridge with his platoon to organise the defence of the area. Just then, another messenger of ill fortune arrived from 2 platoon on the eastern bank, where they had landed, to say that the platoon commander, David Wood, his number 2, the platoon sergeant, and another man had all been wounded while clearing the German trenches. A corporal had taken charge, however, and the trenches were now in our hands. So far, so good. The canal bridge had been taken, but what about the Orne River Bridge? This is the bridge in the left centre of this aerial view, and it's about 450 metres from the canal bridge, which you see here in the top left corner of the slide. Nothing had been heard from there, but now Howard's radio operator suddenly made contact with 6 platoon. Dennis Fox and his platoon had landed on the landing zone as planned and had taken the bridge without firing a shot. You can see his intact glider in the field immediately above the bridge in this picture. This is the bridge, and it was fortunate for them that there was no opposition, as they seemed to be on their own. 4 platoon, accompanied by the company second in command, had not turned up. The other platoon, 5 platoon, landed half a mile off target, and when Todd Sweeney, the platoon commander, finally arrived at the bridge, he found Fox standing quietly on the bridge smoking a cigarette. In response to Sweeney's anxious inquiry about the situation, his laconic reply was, "Well, so far the exercise is going fine, but I can't find any bloody umpires." Howard breathed a sigh of relief when he heard the report from the Orne Bridge. He ordered Sweeney to secure it and told Fox to join him on the canal to carry out fighting patrols in Benouville, the village just west of the canal. Both bridges captured, and 5 of the 6 gliders on the spot within 30 minutes of landing was a better result than he had dared hope for. He told his signaller to send the code word for the success of the operation, ham and jam, and awaited developments. Howard had been ordered to hold the bridges after their capture until relieved by 7th Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. At 0050 hours, half an hour after landing, D Company were cheered to hear the roar of Dakotas overhead and to see some of the parachutes as 7 Para and the rest of the 3rd and the 5th Parachute Brigades dropped from their aircraft. The 7th Battalion were part of the Parachute Assault Force and had been ordered to take over the bridgehead around the village of Benouville, thus leaving Howard and his men with the task of close protection for the canal bridge, and to be ready to provide further support if needed. D Company may have been aware of the relief force in the distance, but they were to have plenty of anxious moments before the parachute troops reached the canal. At 0130, Howard heard the sound he'd been dreading, the sinister grinding and clanking sound of armoured vehicles moving around to the west of Benouville. Fox's platoon were then holding the area just west of the cafe and had a Piat anti-tank gun in position covering the road to the bridge. The Piat was the only infantry anti-tank weapon at the time, but to have a chance of success with it, the gunner had to wait until the approaching armour was only 50 metres away before firing. Reloading took some time, so it was unlikely he would get a second chance. Fox's platoon held its breath as the noise of tanks grew louder, and then two dim shapes appeared at the T-junction. This turned out to be two half-track reconnaissance vehicles. They might have looked like this. The Piat gunner, Private Wagger Thornton, took aim, waited as the lead vehicle came on, and then fired, scoring a direct hit, and the half-track exploded in spectacular fashion and continued to blast off with explosions and to illuminate the darkness for half an hour. Here is an artist's idea of the scene. Hearing and seeing this from a distance, the men of Savon-Para, approaching Bénouville, thought the D Company must have been fighting for their lives. The racket seemed to deter the Germans too, but the other vehicle backed off, and for the time being, no German counterattack materialised. Towards daybreak, when Savon-Para arrived, however, there was quite a lot of enemy activity in Bénouville, and the fighting in the village lasted most of the day. As dawn broke, Howard made his way to the Gondry Cafe, just over the bridge and on the left, here, which was being used as a medical aid post. There he received a great welcome from the Gondry family, who invited him to help dig up a stock of champagne which had been buried in the garden for the previous 4 years. After this, D Company passed a strange sort of day. There was a moment of humour when two very confused Italians were flushed from the undergrowth close to the canal bridge. They turned out to be members of a working party for the Germans, erecting the very poles around the landing zones that Howard had been so concerned about before the operation. The British called it Rommel's asparagus. Here is another picture of these poles on a landing zone later on D-Day. The Italians begged to be allowed to continue their task, as they knew that when the Germans returned to check on them, that they would be furious. So Howard let them get on with their task, and they were quite happy for the rest of the day erecting poles around the deserted and broken gliders. There were also some moments of drama. Sniping and mortar fire harassed Howard's force throughout the day, and early in the morning, two gunboats sailing down the canal from Caen towards the sea were disabled and their crews captured. They might have looked like this. There was still quite a lot of shooting going on when Lord Lovat and his 1st Special Service Brigade arrived on foot from Sword Beach just after midday. Later in the day, Howard's company were relieved on the bridges by men of the Royal Warwicks. You can see them passing here, passing the Café Gondry. And they rejoined their own battalion, by then in the Ronville area, to the east of the River Orne. In this astonishingly successful Coup de Main operation, D Company had 14 men wounded and 2 men killed in capturing the bridges. Den Brotheridge was one who died. The other was Lance Corporal Fred Greenhalgh, who was thrown out of the 3rd glider as it landed by the canal bridge and is thought to have drowned in a pond. The names of all those who took part are today commemorated on 6 stones which stand in the garden of the Pegasus Bridge Museum, which is between the 2 bridges, between the canal and the river. And they are just beside the old bridge, which also has a place in the garden. Ironically, a few days later, Howard's company took part in an inconclusive operation around the village of Escoville, to the east of Ronville, which cost them over 60 casualties. But that's another story.
Thank you, David. I think you'll all agree that that was an amazing tale of heroism on that first day of D-Day. It's a story rarely told. I'm really glad we've been able to tell it. Before we go, can I just say thank you to Landmark for the sponsorship, and to Clive and Heidi and Ella and Hannah and Joe for helping us put this together. But don't go away, because David and I are going to be back for a live Q&A session in a few moments. Thank you for being with us.
The question and answer session will start shortly. The Q&A window will open below the video window. Please log in or use the guest chat link to ask a question.
Evening, everybody. Very nice to see you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We were rather worried that this delay may have caused some of you to go away. Well, actually, more than 800 of you have joined in. So without further ado, because we've got a lot to cover, we're going to go straight into the Q&A. And I'm here in the Middle Wallop, and I'm joined in Winchester by David Innes from the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. And he and I are ready to answer your questions. The first question I'm going to throw to David is actually one that's come on an email. And it's actually a very sensible question. It's, what were the main elements that contributed to the success of that operation to capture the bridges over the Orne River and the Caen Canal? David, welcome, and over to you.
After D-Day, General Gale, commander of 6th Airborne Division, said that to be effective, this operation to seize the two bridges must come like a bolt from the blue. And of course, that's exactly what happened. And that's how John Howard achieved his success. But to enable him to do that, the factors which made the difference to John Howard, I think, first of all, were intelligence. He had very good, up-to-date air photographs upon which to plan his operation. There was also some very helpful French resistance input, which assisted him in this. So you remember the big model which they had laid out in the Nissenhut building at Tarrant Rushton. That was all put together because of the excellent air photograph coverage that they had of the target area. Because by having that sort of information about what he was going to do and where he was going to do it enabled John Howard to develop a detailed and flexible plan, which backed up by thorough preparation and planning, and then tested by training, detailed training, lengthy training and practice, or rehearsal, you could say, made the difference here and gave every man in his force confidence in what they themselves had to do and what their neighbors were going to do. And they also knew exactly what to do if things didn't go according to plan.
So we're talking here about a standard coup de main operation. We're talking about surprise, we're talking about good training, we're talking about knowing what the objectives are, and I suppose some mission command, because if your officer is killed, then the NCO can step in and knows exactly what's going to happen.
Exactly. And as we discovered in the operation, two of the platoons were eventually commanded by corporals who did excellently well because their officers and their senior ranks were injured. There was another factor which we must take into account, Paul, which is the business of air superiority. The Allies had total air superiority on D-Day. This meant that when dawn came up, at the start of that long, long day, when dawn came up on the 6th of June, and it didn't get dark until very late, all that time there was a considerable danger that their operation to capture the bridges, their holding of the bridges by then, would be interfered with and disrupted by enemy armoured reserves. There were enemy armoured reserves around, as we'll hear, but they never got the order to move in time, and because of air superiority, the moment they did move, their activities were disrupted and broken up by Allied air activity and by ship-to-shore artillery or gunfire, which made all the difference. So those were the main factors, I think, which enabled John Howard to achieve that incredible success, that incredible surprise, and to retain control of the bridges until he finally left them almost 24 hours after he'd arrived there.
So one more question from the emails that have come in before we go to the live ones which are coming in on email. I've always been surprised that the bridges weren't blown by the sentries the moment they saw the gliders there. So did they actually put explosive charges on the bridges?
There were 5 sappers in each glider, as you remember, and they were led by Captain Jock Nielsen. And they very quickly found the sappers that got to the bridges. Some of them didn't, of course, as you know, but they very quickly found that neither bridge had explosives actually laid on the bridge. But by the canal bridge, they found a hut with a whole lot of prepared charges, but they hadn't actually been distributed, they hadn't actually been laid on the bridges, and they certainly weren't armed. Had the bridges been destroyed, or had D Company failed to seize them, there were 4 collapsible boats in the gliders which could have been used to paddle over the obstacle, and so D Company could have got to the other side if they had to, in the event that wasn't required. But the fact that the Germans regretted bitterly not blowing those bridges, I think, is borne out by the fact that at about 1000 hours on D-Day, well into the day by then, they didn't deploy their armored reserve, but they sent an aircraft with a bomb, and the aircraft bombed the bridge, hit the bridge with a big bomb, but it just clattered, it just clanged off the superstructure of the bridge and dropped into the water. Had it been armed, had it been interfered with, who knows? The fact is that we had a very, very lucky escape. And John Howard, I think, he saw the aircraft coming, they expected the worst, and because the aircraft was so accurate with its bomb dropping, they expected to lose the bridge, but it didn't happen.
David, thank you. That's a really good way to start our evening. So now let's go to the Q&As which have come in on the email. Graham Cooper's question: what would have happened had the Coup de Main operation not succeeded? How would, if the bridges had been blown before them, or as the Germans saw them land, or if they had not been able to hold the bridges, where would D-Day have gone?
Well, I think that if the Germans could have got direct fire to bear on the beaches, and of course they had small arms, of course, on the beaches and artillery, but if they could have got their reserves onto the further forward, there would have been very different. It could have been a very different story on the beaches. But the fact is that they didn't make an effort to do that, and they didn't make an effort to do that because their own intelligence was thin, and the result was that they let the Allied operations in the dark unfold, and by the time daylight came up, the parachute brigades were all over that part of Normandy like a rash, and fighting was going on in many parts of it. Merville Battery was very close to this position, and by the time it got into daylight, we talked about the air superiority which the Allies retained, and it was one of the most significant elements in the success of the operation. The Allies made sure that the Germans could not move heavy vehicles, they could not move armored formations, they could not move their reserve because they were spotted and engaged, both by air and also from the sea.
So air supremacy, good naval gunfire support, all of those things. What happens, David, when we have these Q&As, which is really good, is you get people sending us emails and saying, by the way, I have a connection. General Gale's driver's son, Ian Hensley, has just sent us an email. Do get in touch with David at the museum, Ian, the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. I'm sure he'd be delighted to hear from you. You might have something that will absolutely be able to help us there. Steve has just said, yes, all 6 tugs and gliders flew out of Tarrant Rushden, I think, as we said in the lecture, and as I'd always thought. Anonymous has said, Uncle Pat Turner in Glider 3 said that the thing he remembered most visibly was the sheer amount of noise. That would have been noise as it flew, of course, but also as it hit the ground. And it always surprises me that the Germans really didn't hear the gliders coming to a halt. They must have heard the second and third. The first one, perhaps they thought aircraft flying over or something, but it's a very noisy thing, landing a glider, particularly if you're inside it, because it does seem to really give you an impression of a lot of noise. Frank Saunders has said, how were the glider pilots trained for how long? We're actually going to cover that, Frank, in another talk. We've decided we're going to have a third one in this series where we're going to talk about the planning and the training in real time. We've got an email from Toulouse, from Guillaume Deguin in Toulouse, who say, c'est chaud, it's hot, it's good. He's really enjoying that. That's absolutely fantastic. Gilliam, great to hear from you. Say hi to Olive. I trust everything in Toulouse is going well. And what normally happens, those who are joining us on the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum website, is that we have regular viewers from Seattle, from Washington, DC, from Australia, from France, and from Germany. So to all our international friends and guests, really good to see you. And do, when you're in Britain, go up to Woodstock to David's Museum, and of course come to us at Middle Wallop for the Army Flying Museum. Yeah, there's several people, Gilliam I think is one, and several others have said that they're, don't forget Richard Todd, who plays in The Longest Day, was actually at D-Day, and was, I think, he meets himself in the movie, which is always the famous line.
He does. I think he was in Seven Para, wasn't he?
He was, yeah.
And he played John Howard.
Yes.
In the movie The Longest Day. It might interest you, Paul. You were mentioning about how did they not hear it. I got an eyewitness account here from one of the German sentries who, after the war, made a report on what he saw. He was captured, of course, but what he saw that night, which I think might be interesting for people, actually, because big as the glider was, 7 tons, as you said, fully loaded, it still didn't make that much of a noise when it crashed. This is what he said. He was on the canal bridge, and so he says this: suddenly we heard a swishing noise and saw a large silent aircraft flying low towards the canal bridge. It crashed in a small field very close to the bridge, only about 50 meters away. At first, we thought it was one of our crippled bombers, and we wondered whether to take a look at it or wake the sergeant. We were moving forward cautiously when we heard what seemed to be the sound of running feet. And before we knew it, we were confronted by a bunch of about 10 wild-looking men who were charging towards us. They were armed, but they didn't shoot. We were just 2 boys alone, so we ran. We could see that we were outnumbered, but I still managed to fire off a signal flare to try to warn the rest of our garrison of about 20 men who were sleeping nearby. One of our comrades had had a birthday party the previous night, and they'd all been drinking in the cafe until 10 p.m. So they were well asleep. A little bit of luck here too, Paul, another factor in their success.
Well, every great success, every great military operation needs a bit of luck. Was it not Napoleon who said, "Give me generals who are lucky"? Yeah, exactly. And I think that's very true.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of people have said that they were going to be very happy to help with family recollections for training glider pilots. So that would be really good. Please contact us if you would at the Army Flying Museum, and we'll coordinate it from here, because I think this is really, really good. Deb says glider pilots also fought alongside the infantry soldiers on landing. Absolutely, not so much here, but very much. in the case in the Arnhem operation that, the following September, and again in Varsity in the March of 1945 and crossing the Rhine. And that was the whole point of the Glider Pilot Regiment. These were soldiers who flew, and if they had to, they could pick up a rifle or a machine gun or a grenade or a mortar and be a useful contribution to the fight that was going on. And the other thing I think is really good, David and I were discussing earlier, these are NCOs. The gliders were flown by non-commissioned officers, staff sergeants and sergeants. Interestingly, the Royal Air Force tug aircraft, I think 5 out of the 6 were also flown by warrant officers, by senior NCOs as well. And I think that's a great testament to the way that we trained people and the way that these things work. Our NCOs are the backbone of the British Army and remain so. Yes, another, Douglas Hedgley said his uncle Pat said that his first time in action, I would imagine, is an appalling noise in action. I remember the first time I heard weapons firing for real. I couldn't believe how noisy it was. David, I'm sure you had exactly the same thing. Movies, it goes bang bang, and people have conversations. In real life, things that go bang bang actually make a huge noise and cause real problems for people. A lot of disorientation.
Paul, did you say there was an earlier question about were the bridges in fact rigged for demolition? Was there a question about that?
Yes, there was a question for that. Yes. Were they rigged, David?
The answer to that is that there were 5 sappers in each glider, as you know, and the senior amongst them was Captain Jock Nielsen. They quickly found out that actually there were no explosive charges laid on either bridge, which was, I think, pretty remarkable, really. But they also found at the Canal Bridge a stock of charges which had been prepared but not actually laid and not actually armed, and that was very close to the bridge, but they hadn't actually been laid. I mentioned the 4 collapsible boats which were standing by in case they needed to cross the river. The fact that the Germans did not put the bridge out of action, and the fact that they regretted that, was borne out by the attack on the bridge at about 10 o'clock on D-Day by a German bomber, which dived on the bridge and dropped a bomb which hit the bridge. Amazingly, it did not go off. There was a tremendous clang as it hit the superstructure of the bridge and then dropped into the water. But for some reason, it didn't go off. And that was very fortunate. It would have been a very different story.
The bomb probably wasn't fused. But I find that fascinating because only 4 years before, when the Germans assaulted the forts at Liège, they were rigged for demolition, but nobody gave the Belgian soldiers, no officer would give them the order to blow any of the casements or bridges or whatever. You'd think the Germans would have learned that lesson, that bridges which their intelligence would have also shown them were vital to any operation if they were guarding them. So they must have thought they were vital. I'm surprised at the lack of demolition charges. There are other cases of that we know of, that indeed they where bridges and the like were seen were found to be without the normal precaution of demolition.
I don't know is the answer to that, but this is a classic one, of course, because these bridges should have been armed. They were crucial, but they weren't expected. The Allied bridgehead was not expected in this area.
Peter Rowe says, why didn't the Germans counterattack in strength? Well, I think we've answered that, because the 21st Panzer weren't allowed to move because they were under Hitler's orders. And I don't think they had other things on their mind by the time it got to daylight, like the largest ever amphibious force landing just a few miles away. Would that be right?
Yes, I'm sure that's correct. I think that had von Luck managed to move his Panzer regiment closer to the bridges in the dark, it could have been a very different sort of story. but we got away with it in that case. And it was the retention of this command and control at such a high level which buggered the whole thing up for them, really.
And yet we always credit the Germans with having mission command and all these successes that Rommel had in the desert, 2 years before, down to the fact that they could take the initiative. It's quite remarkable that here at D-Day, that in June 1944, that wasn't there.
Yes. Yeah.
Stephen Bamber, thank you for your kind words. Stephen says to a marvellous talk, David. The accuracy of the glider pilots is incredible. It is, and we quoted in the talk, David quoted in the talk, Trafford Leigh-Mallory, not known to be that warm towards the army, in saying the greatest feat of flying in the Second World War. And considering the cast-off and the navigation and landing on the objective, I think it really is quite amazing. Somebody called Beaker Williams says, why wasn't Lance Corporal Fred Greenhalgh actually buried at Ranville, where presumably where he fell? Is there a reason for that?
Well, I don't know is the answer to that. We'll have to investigate that with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, but it is unfortunate, I couldn't agree more, that in order to pay our respects to Fred Greenhalgh, who died that night, we have to go to a cemetery much closer to Sword Beach, actually. So it's well to the west and the north from where he actually died in that pond, which is a most unfortunate thing. Den Brotheridge, his grave is actually in the churchyard in Ranville, and so easily. Yeah. It is quite a thought, I know. I don't think there's anything to be done about this at this stage, but we do make, when we go and pay our annual visits to that part of the world, several people do go and salute his grave and lay wreaths there.
Which I think is really, really important. Stephen Luscombe said he used to work in Le Havre, and he's been to see the Pegasus Bridge and the museum, which he thinks is very impressive. I should also give a shout out for the Café Gondry, which has its own small museum on the bridge there, and Madame Gondry is always very hospitable to her English friends who go across, particularly the Army Air Corps, and always worth going in there and asking for a Café Calvados if you're across. Although, of course, we're not going to be doing a lot of travelling this year, I don't think, in time. Right, I'm just going now through. Gosh, we've got a lot of questions here. So who takes credit for being the first man on French soil? Well, the Glider Pilot Regiment, I'm going to say here, take credit for being the first to land on French soil at D-Day, because the first glider's crew, Warwick and I think Ainsborough, his co-pilot, were catapulted through the canopy and ended up headfirst on French soil. So the Glider Pilot Regiment would like to think that. That's Mike Huggins who's asked that. What do you reckon with your rifles tie on there, David? Do you reckon there's a light infantry there?
No, I reckon probably that you're right about that, actually. Although the first chap out of the door would probably have been Den Brotheridge, I guess.
Yes. Yeah.
He was right beside. He was just sitting on Howard's right and had opened the door, as you remember, slid the door up into the ceiling of the glider, and I guess that he was the first man out, probably, very quickly followed by the rest of his platoon, who made their way up onto the bridge.
So the interesting thing, several people have questioned us about this. It's the shock and awe of landing, let alone the Germans being surprised and taken off guard. To be disorientated at night in a glider, it's pitch black. You've come to a bang of a halt, and you get out, and nobody shoots their comrade in the back because they've taken the safety off their rifle. No, there's no casualties of their own there. There's nothing self-inflicted, it appears, in this. And they were all agile enough to get out and do the job. I think that's remarkable. And it says a lot about the light infantry and their training.
I think they were acutely aware of the landmarks which they ought to see on getting out of their crashed and broken glider. They should have been expecting to see the looming turret of the bridge, the building, the Café Gondry opposite, and the bank of the canal. And I think that's because they landed facing north, back facing the way in which they'd actually come from England. They were expecting that, and they were very fortunate that the glider didn't turn round, for example, on landing and spew people out in a disoriented fashion. They were lucky to be able to recognize their surroundings once they hit the ground. And I think that probably must have been one of the major points in training. How on earth do you make sure that on exiting the glider, in order to carry out your task, how do you orientate yourself effectively?
Yes, and I think that's all part of the credit we must give to the glider pilots in getting the aircraft down exactly in the right place. I think that's remarkable. Here's one you'll like, David, from Richard Stickland, who said decorations and bravery awards. Well, I tell you, the glider pilots all received distinguished flying medals and equivalents. What about everybody else? You know, John Howard, etc.
Well, John Howard was given an got my note on that somewhere here. He was awarded a distinguished service order pretty well immediately after the event. The French government further rewarded him in the early 50s with a Croix de Guerre avec Palme, which he was very proud to have, actually. And it's always very good to see John Howard's set of medals with these two in particular on the right-hand side of Penny Bates's chest when she attends annual commemorations at the bridge. There were two MCs awarded that night. One was to Sandy Smith, who was the young platoon commander who crossed the bridge with a broken arm to take over Den Brotheridge's platoon as well as his own after the landing. David Wood did not get an MC. He was subsequently awarded an MBE, but he was wounded on the east bank of the canal. The other one who received an MC the following day, actually, was Todd Sweeney during a serious action in Escoville, which cost the company an awful lot of injured people. There were military medals for, there we are. No, I don't seem to have it here. I seem to have lost my note on that. Never mind. Military medals for Lance Corporal Stacey was one who got a military medal, I know. And there was another military medal awarded that evening.
We have them listed on, I think, on the Army Flying Museum website as well, and we certainly have them there. I'm sure your museum does as well. We've got Mark has asked us what happened to the sixth glider, the one that went to the Dive. Well, that's the one that was cast off, in fact, by its tug rather than its casting off itself, and went to the Dive River, which is, just as a matter of interest, the river on which William the Conqueror built his ships for the invasion in 1066. What happened to that was the crew and the soldiers got out. They captured the bridge, held it for a while. They realized it was the wrong bridge, and in the best traditions of the British Army, fighting withdraw until they got to Roundville, where they were reunited with the rest of their company. So that's what happened to that one. There is a photograph somewhere, but I'm not quite sure if we've included it. There's lots of people sending us. I'm not going to be able to mention everyone because we've got so many questions, but with family connections. If you've got family connections, we would love to, both museums would love to hear from you. Just write in, please, to info@the museums, and we'll try and coordinate this and see if we can use this again, because I think these are, there's a lot more we can give here. Mark Edmonds said, what nav aids did the gliders have? They didn't. They had a map and a stopwatch, and there's a compass in the aircraft. And it was all about it was all about the skill of flying. It's how flying was done. They were lucky the river showed up with the moon, and they were able to navigate. But at the end of the day, it was absolutely flying skills. Now, we've got a question, David, I know that you and I have discussed before, and I'm glad it's here. How did we build all of those gliders? Well, I did a bit of research in our archive on that. 4,959 gliders were built by the Brits in the Second World War, really from 1941 onwards. David, you did some research on this when you built your replica, didn't you?
Yes, we, in the talk, I was standing in front of a replica section, Paul, of a Horsa glider. I got the specifications for that from your museum, actually. It's when we first started partnering, although we didn't quite think of it in those sort of ways at the time. But
that we could help.
This is all part of our Pegasus Bridge display. The section we got in Woodstock is actually built by Paul Grelier of Airwork in Crawley, a little village in Hampshire. And it was funded by generous donors in memory of some of the furniture making companies that built gliders in World War II. And it was a remarkable piece of ingenuity, really, to turn furniture making companies into airframe making companies, because that's what was needed at the time. And there, I think I'm right in saying, Paul, there are 30 separate parts to a Horsa glider. So there's a great deal of work for people, nice work if you can get it, if you like. The furniture making companies which we commemorate in the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, because we received donations in their memory, were Parker Knoll, E. Gom, which became G-Plan, of course, Wesley Barrell, which is a Whitney firm, Harris Liebus were the main ones, but there were other companies as well, which did a lot of glider construction.
It's interesting because, of course, they also built components for the Mosquito, for de Havilland.
Yeah.
And it was using the skills that we had. We have in the Army Flying Museum a little tableau which shows people working, carpenters working. I think it's it, and a lot of them were female. The smallest production unit in Britain for the Ministry of Aircraft Production was in High Wycombe, and it was a ladies' sewing circle that sewed the canvas on the elevators for Mosquitoes and Horsas. Now, there were 8 of them, and they were all over 80. I find that quite remarkable. They had a representative of the Ministry of Aircraft Production who went to see them every now and then and have a cup of tea and make sure they're okay, and they wouldn't stop. And there's some wonderful photographs of that. Robert Baker's asked me, why did the Horsa have such big windows? I think presumably you mean at the front, the canopy there. Robert, why is that? Why is there so much glass? And the answer is you do need to actually see where you're going in a glider. If you haven't got an engine, you're only going there once. So when you start your descent into Pegasus Bridge, you need to be able to see it all the way down, because there's no chance of opening any throttles because you don't have them. Let's have a look. What else here? We have got dozens of questions. Sorry, I'm just going past the ones that tell us that they can't hear us very well. I trust everyone can now hear us well. Why was the operation of greetings from the Netherlands from Johan van Hammeren, who says, why was it called Dead Stick? It was the next operational name on the list. It was part of Tonga, which was the next one. And I've said this before, and David, I'm sure you've been in this position. When I was in the General Staff, I remember seeing the list of operational names, and CGS was asked, pick a name, sir. And we did, and that was Herrick that came out of that one. So now, somebody said that his father was the navigator in LL278 Halifax, and
he thinks that we may have had a photograph which we showed of that. So anonymous, don't know who you are, so sadly can't get back to you on that one. Somebody said that for reality's sake, he's flown in gliders, big gliders, and they were like backing Broncos, and a lot of the soldiers would have been violently sick. It's probably true, actually. Yeah. I can imagine that. I don't personally like sailplanes. They have a tendency to, I don't like not having a rotor over my head, I suppose, what it is. Mark Edmonds says, well, brilliant. And he's donated to both museums. Thank you. We really need that at the moment. Lawrence Dooley says there's a lady who lives in his village who was present at the night of the assault. Her family owned the cafe. I think you're probably referring to Arlette Gondry, who spends her winter in England. Lawrence, we know Arlette very well. She's a lovely lady. I recommend anyone who goes there to Normandy to Pegasus Bridge to call in on the cafe. What role was played, David, by the French resistance in this operation? I think we've mentioned intelligence gathering, but they didn't do any fighting as such, did they?
No, not that I'm aware of. There may have been some, of course, in Benouville. There was a French resistance cell, if I could use such an expression, these days in Benouville. And I think they were instrumental in passing back helpful information, particularly on things like the Rommel's asparagus and that sort of thing. But I don't think they actually engaged the Germans at all on behalf of the Allies in Benouville or that sort of area, although they might have done further east, I guess.
Roy Ratzier, I hope I get this right, Ratzier, has asked about liaison between the bridge and the Merville battery. Was there any liaison during the day with the rest of the airborne landing?
It sounds to me like Roy Ratazzi is asking the question, which I'm very pleased.
Roy Ratazzi, yes.
Very good. I don't believe so, Roy. I think that, of course, John Howard is acutely aware that parachute forces were targeted onto the Merville battery, but the Merville battery was some distance from him, and he didn't expect, I don't think, any activity, any sort of liaison, particularly with them. His main concern, John Howard's main concern, was to establish links with 7 Para. He knew that 7 Para were supposed to be coming to take over overall security of the bridge area probably by 1 o'clock in the morning, actually, which was only 45 minutes after they landed. But in fact, they didn't actually make it until about 3 o'clock, when he met Colonel Geoffrey Pine Coffin, who was the commanding officer on the bridge. John Howard was always very complimentary, I know, and very aware of the very, very difficult battle that 7 Para had. And it's because they were so badly scattered over a wide area when they landed that they had such a difficult time getting people together, even though they then got into action very quickly in Benouville, having landed further to the west, to the east, I should say. John Howard wrote a book, and this is his book. It's called The Pegasus Diaries, The Private Papers of Major John Howard. Everybody tells a different story about a particular incident, don't they? You may think it's very easy to remember exactly the events that they unfolded that you see, but in fact, everyone remembers these things differently. And John Howard's story, which really is based on his diaries, edited by his daughter Penny Bates, is as good a place as any to start studying this interesting Coup de Main operation, which has so many different and fascinating aspects to look at, really. And I think it was instructive to me to find out how very important 7 Para were to John Howard, and he always retained a very, very strong affection for the representatives of 7 Para, who made it back to the bridge to talk to him and meet him and so on.
It's interesting here. One of our emails in from Ian Hennessy says John Howard had told him that it was Bill Bailey who took out the pillbox. I've heard several people credited with taking out the pillbox at the other side of the bridge.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have anything to say about that.
Yeah, it's difficult always with these. Lots of people giving us great credits here, which is lovely. Were any of the gliders salvaged? Or I would imagine the French very quickly used the wood from the gliders for their own purposes.
I'm sure they did, and they would have been extremely useful as storage areas and that sort of thing. I heard a story the other day of a glider, the remains of a glider being used as a log shed, I think, or a garden shed in Oxfordshire somewhere.
Yeah, well, our Hamel car in the museum, I think, was a shed, and I think part of our Horsa also was that as well. But David, sadly, we have gone on half an hour longer than we had planned to, which with the technical problems at the beginning, I'm not surprised. Can I just say to everybody, I'm really sorry about those technical issues we had at the beginning, and they weren't my fault, I'm delighted to say, and they weren't David's fault, and they weren't Clive's fault. They were a fault of the system. So we're delighted we've been able to do this. Please, with your comments about friends, relatives, etc., particularly on the training and the planning, do email us. We won't get back to you immediately. We'll coordinate them all together and see what we've got. But we would like to take this on. This is an amazing operation, not just because it's the first in D-Day, but because it was a success, because of the way air landing troops from the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry and the Glider Pilot Regiment worked together, the Royal Engineers, we should remember, and Royal Army Medical Corps, of course, as well. Can I say on behalf of the Army Flying Museum that it's been great being with you tonight, but it's been especially good because we've had David Innes, who obviously is on top of his brief and knows so much about this. I'm going to give the final words to David, who I think is going to tell you about his next, or the next lecture coming out of his museum. You know about ours. That's the 22nd of February on V for Valour. But David, over to you for the closing words.
Our next talk in our series, and this is the first, and we hope to do several more. And the next one will be on the 52nd Light Infantry at Waterloo, by the very well-known author and Napoleonic War historian, Gareth Glover. The story we've told tonight of the 2nd Battalion, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry at Pegasus Bridge, they were the 52nd. They are the direct descendants from the 52nd who fought at Waterloo. And the controversy that still persists about what happened at Waterloo and where the final credit should go will always will persist forever, I suspect, because it's just one of those things. It'll run and run. But Gareth Glover has written a new book, 2 new books actually, on the subject about the 52nd at Waterloo. And it's called The Great Waterloo Controversy, the story of the 52nd afoot at history's greatest battle. And that will be our next online talk, and very much hope to see as many people as can join us then. Many thanks indeed for coming along tonight. And by all means, come and see us and see the Pegasus Bridge display at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum in Woodstock. We'd be delighted to meet you. Many thanks.
So good night, everybody, and we'll see you very soon, I hope. David, thank you. Thank you, Clive. Thank you, everybody, for being there.